Hello, everybody. I'm Rana Foroohar. I'm a global business columnist for the FT, an analyst for CNN, and an author. And I'm very, very honored and pleased to be speaking here with people that I'm usually calling on for wisdom as sources. So nice to see so many of you here, and also to be able to give a first look and my first thoughts, really, about my new book, The Homecoming, Why Place Matters in a Multipolar World, which is going to be out in October of 2022. I have no idea why the book business still takes a year to get books out, but at some point, maybe someone will disrupt it. I'm taking a little bit of a risk, actually, in giving these comments because the book is somewhat critical about conventional economics. My take as a journalist for the last 30 years, covering business and economics on 3 different continents, is that economists really like to think that reality can be captured in mathematical formulas. Not all the economists here, of course, who are interested in a lot of social and cultural issues as well. But this idea that we can plug numbers into complicated formulas about how we work, what we spend, where we live, when we might die, and create these models to simulate our world, and that those models then shape policies and the way in which we can live our lives and the way in which we make decisions is, I think, a little bit naive, because I think of economics much more as a messy science, not like physics, but really like biology, something that is a very human science, something that needs to be looked at not just from the top down, but from the bottom up. And I think that that's something that the world at large is coming to realize. Certainly since the financial crisis and since the COVID pandemic, it's become quite clear to a lot of people that the invisible hand that is supposed to guide our markets towards a healthy and happy equilibrium isn't always right. We live in a real world, a world of power, a world of human biases, a world of the political economy and institutions that don't always work the way that models say they will. And this is where I've spent my career, over 30 years as a journalist. Now, reporters, like many normal people, know that rationality doesn't always translate in quite the way that experts think it will. And just as an example of that, I want to share with you a conversation I had a few years back with the now late Richard Trumka, who used to head the AFL-CIO, wonderful, wonderful man, former coal miner, lawyer, leading light of the labor movement. And he and I were discussing at that time the lived reality of American trade policy and the way in which things had really played out on the ground. And he told me about a conversation that he had had around the time that certain trade deals were being negotiated in the 1990s. And I think that this was an aha moment for me about why things have ended up the way they have and why we are so polarized at the moment. He told me that during that time he'd had a conversation with a Clinton administration policymaker about the potential fallout of NAFTA, the free trade agreement that the US was about to cut with Mexico and Canada, as well as the impact that China might have on the global trading system. And he expressed concern that there was going to be a flood of cheap labor into the global marketplace, and that this was going to have a big effect not just on sheer wages for American workers, but for entire societies, swaths of the country, people's marriages, how their children would live, what society would look like in these places. And he said to me, he said, I told the official that the deals would kill us, and he agreed. But he said after a while, wages would start to go up again, and things would even out around the world. And I asked Rich, I said, well, did you ask how long it would take for wages to even out? And he said, yeah, I did. And that the official answered, within 3 to 5 generations. So let's just land on that for a minute, okay? 3 to 5 generations. I don't need to repeat all the work that's been done by people smarter than me about what has happened in all of those communities since. I grew up in one, actually. But I would just say that it's no surprise to me that large swaths of the country, which frankly I don't believe are widely racist or crazy, don't trust technocratic elites making policy right now. I don't think it's any surprise that we have the most polarized political environment in U.S. history, or that we've had an attempted coup in our capital, or an opioid crisis, or deaths of despair amongst people that feel completely forgotten and almost like algorithmic inputs into formulas that have nothing to do with their felt experience. I don't think it's odd at all that we have a generation of millennials that now make up the largest voting and working blocs in the country, but they're increasingly disenchanted with both capitalism and liberal democracy and inclined to side with the more extreme elements within either party. And I don't think it's a surprise that the population at large feels that globalization itself has failed. You can look actually at a 2020 Pew Research study that found that most people in the US and the UK had negative feelings about it, and some of the words that they associated were loss, longing, a feeling of being left behind or swept away. Now, feelings are one thing, but failure itself depends on the metric that you use. And of course, we all know that globalization has made the planet as a whole wealthier and more prosperous. Many of us have done extremely well in the last 40 years, but that growth has largely been concentrated at the very top in the hands of a cosmocratic elite, and to a certain extent at the bottom. Wages grew in a lot of developing countries, most particularly in China, with very positive results. But within most countries, inequality has grown. And I think that that's the reason you're seeing widespread populism, nationalism, and a rise of autocracy in many parts of the world that feel that something in this system desperately needs tweaking. Now, until quite recently, the economics profession had presumed that countries, companies, markets, and individuals were eventually going to reset to normal, AKA growth would go back. We would somehow land up somewhere in the sort of apex of globalization in the mid-1990s. Linear systems, baseline reversion to equilibrium, these are how folks put it. Economic efficiency rather than resiliency was encouraged in all of this. But this is the mainstream economics that's been taught in universities and business schools over the last 40 years, and I would argue that it's flawed. I think it's what supported the just-in-time business culture in which redundancy in supply chains, for example, was considered a waste of time and money. And the free flow of capital, goods, and labor across borders to create more economic growth was always a good thing, despite any inequality and financial fragility that they might create. The idea that there might be human costs to efficiency, and that these costs might in turn come with their own snowball cycle of political economic risk just wasn't considered in the models. Now, COVID-19 has sort of ripped the scales from our eyes on such assumptions, and suddenly it matters where we source much needed products. Suddenly it matters that we live in a country with a bifurcated healthcare system and incredibly spotty broadband coverage. It matters that the economy is largely built on debt and asset bubbles rather than on income growth and good jobs. And I think that the pandemic and its aftermath have started to drive home a message that many of us thought was maybe going to be heard right after the great financial crisis, which is that if we are to solve the world's biggest problems, from pandemics and climate change to the inequalities of globalization, then economists are going to need to stop tweaking the edges of their models and start thinking outside the box. And our elected officials and business leaders, too, have to begin to think in far more nuanced terms about what exactly constitutes economic well-being, a point that Ned was making earlier, not just at the global level, but at a local one, too, in people's backyards where they live. So we know that any economy goes through cycles of expansion and contraction, boom and bust, but the most important of these cycles has little to do with market prices or unemployment rates. It's about a fundamental sense of economic well-being, and that's less of a matter of short-term data than it is of the underlying political philosophy, and two questions in particular that all societies must face. What matters and who matters, and how should society reflect those interests? And, you know, this calibration is never sort of set forth like some article in the Constitution. I would argue that it shifts back and forth depending on the national mood. But whichever perspective it adopts, such a political philosophy ends up being almost a national creed, and one that actually dictates a kind of a code of conduct as it favors one interest group over another, be it the state or the private sector, labor or capital, consumers or producers, rich or poor. It establishes the essential hierarchy of society and the economy. It decides who's on top and who's not. And for decades now, our capitalist creed has been that laissez-faire globalization is good, full stop. But the truth is, it hasn't been good for everyone all the time. There have been winners and losers in the process as it has unfolded over our lifetimes. Taxes have been slashed. Borders have been opened, although far more so for investment than for either the flow of goods or people, which is a crucial point. But labor unions have been squashed. The cost of things that make us middle class, housing, healthcare, and education, these things have all risen dramatically. In fact, that's where most inflation, long-term trend inflation is. Meanwhile, corporate monopoly power has grown and state-run capitalism has grown too. Big companies and some emerging markets have benefited hugely in the last 40 years, but many others less so. Instead of a world economy in service to domestic politics and the welfare of people within a broad range of nation states, we've gotten a world economy in service to itself, run by a small group of people. But I would argue that we're about to see a shift and that the paradigm is changing. These kinds of shifts, I think, are incredibly rare, as earthquakes, really, although not so much anymore, and equally transformative. And I think that we're going through one now. The world's beginning to reset, not to the normal of the 1990s, but to a new normal. So roughly 4 decades ago, America kicked off the last major paradigm shift, you could argue, America and the UK, the supply-side revolution. Capital gains taxes slashed. Reagan and Thatcher took on labor unions, the power of the unions faded, corporations grew, some people got very rich, and the world, as Thomas Friedman famously told us, was flat. Place no longer mattered, but in fact it did. The world was never flat, the world has always been bumpy. Globalization is typically defined as the free movement of goods, people, and capital, but capital, and the people who had most of it, traveled much more freely than either goods or workers. An international elite, of which I am admittedly part, as an educated coastal knowledge worker who writes for the FT and racks up more air miles than I should, I did very well. The people I knew did very well, but we flew over the problems of the nation state on a tide of economic globalization, and lots of people on the ground did not. So I'm very passionate about this topic because I grew up with those people. I grew up as the daughter of a Muslim immigrant small business owner in Red State, Indiana. My dad's a Turk who came to the US, studied engineering, and then married and started a business. But my family, as successful as he was, also lived through some of the supposedly rational economic policies of the 80s and 90s that included the death of family farms, the collapse of small businesses in the places that I lived, deaths of despair, the rise of big box stores, monopoly power, and outsourcing and technological disruption for which workers were not educated. And all of it, to my mind, exemplifies a pendulum that has swung too far towards concentration and corruption in both markets and the state. This is not a silver bullet change. You know, as Joe Stiglitz, one of my, the people I admire most, has made the point many times, this is 40 years of small changes in everything from tax codes to corporate governance to banking regulation to antitrust law. Anglo-American capitalism has morphed into something that I would argue that Adam Smith couldn't even recognize, because, you know, Adam Smith would have said you need equal access to information, a shared understanding of transactions, and a shared moral framework. How many of us would say that in the kind of capitalism we live in today, any of those things are in effect very often? I don't think so. What we have today is no longer a truly free market system that allows for productive and fair transactions between buyers and sellers that exists on an equal footing, but rather a concentrated system of power and oligopoly. And in this world, the multinational corporations and the people that run them are detached from the needs of the countries that spawned them. In the US, for example, 75% of venture capital goes to just 3 coastal states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. half of the job growth in America is in just 75 of its 3,000 counties, most of them along either coast. The same is true to a greater or lesser extent in many other parts of the developed world and some in the developing world as well. And the result is this kind of Hobbesian paradigm in which countries and individuals are pitted constantly against each other. And so I would argue that globalization of the kind that we've known over the last several decades has failed. And it's time for a reset. We need to share the wealth more broadly. We need to understand, as Ned so accurately said in his talk earlier, that economic well-being isn't just about growth, GDP growth at the international or even the national level, but about real people, human beings living in specific communities. People matter, place matters, all places. So what now? How do we create a new vision of shared prosperity for this moment? And in particular, how do we remoor the wealth, the tremendous wealth that has been created at the global level in local communities everywhere? How can we make sure that economic globalization doesn't continue to run so far ahead of national politics and concerns that we get the sort of paradigm that we have today? And how can we fix things, most importantly, in a way that doesn't take us back to 1930s style protectionism, which is a false fit of nostalgia for a past era, or a high-tech dystopia in which the robots are taking our jobs and Amazon eats everyone's lunch? We fret about a lot of these things. I fret about them constantly, but I think, and this is my good news moment, and this book is actually kind of a good news book. I'm giving you the bad background first, but I think some of these changes are already happening. I think that COVID was a kind of a scrim that was pulled up on everything that wasn't working. And as my friend Bill Janeway would say, productivity comes when governments invest in things and the private sector then lets them bubble up into good ideas. And I think that we are beginning to be at a turning point there. I believe that regionalization and localization of economies is going to become much more important in the future. I think that the one world, two systems paradigm is going to be with us, whether the US likes it or not. We just saw a presentation on how well China's system is working for China. But I think we're at a point where the U.S. is beginning to think about new alliances. I'm extremely optimistic about the new U.S.-European Tech Alliance and building a system of a new set of the rules for tech and trade that is really values-based, something that moves us beyond surveillance capitalism and beyond a choice between big tech or big state. Supply chains are shortening, yes. That's resulting in some delays and some inflation. You can't get your tennis balls, you can't get your sneakers. But we're also seeing companies already innovating and moving towards more of the kind of vertical integration that, frankly, I think we never should have let too much go of in the first place. The idea that you can have communities in which production, services, manufacturing, consumption are all grouped together and that these things are iterative and innovation will result, I think it's a powerful idea and you're going to see more of it. The labor capital divide is, of course, shifting, and that's a very big deal. And I think that a wave of technological innovation that we've all enjoyed post-COVID is going to make it possible for jobs to be done in many, many other places. I mean, we are already seeing this profound transformation of the geography of work in this country. You know, look around 3 hours outside of any major city, and there are new communities booming. Once we start adding to that some investment in broadband, some investments in infrastructure, which, fingers crossed, we'll see what happens today, I think that that's going to create and remoor wealth in a lot of new places, and that's a great thing. Now, I don't want to be Panglossian. I think that there's also a possibility, because ideas and digital technology will continue to flow across borders, that we're going to have, and rightfully so, some more outsourcing of white-collar work from rich countries to poor countries. I think we're going to see all kinds of technologically disintermediated jobs in ways that we can't even imagine, and that's a topic for another talk. But I think that what's being really heard now, and I'm encouraged, frankly, because I spend a lot of time talking to people in Washington, policymakers themselves are really finally listening to some of the cries that some of us made after the great financial crisis. When a prevailing philosophy is no longer sustainable, it falls, and it yields to a new one that's better suited to the times. And I would argue that we are leaving the era of rational man and entering a new era of more human-centered, place-based economics. I think the focus is going to be much more on the local and regional, much more on Main Street rather than Wall Street, stakeholders rather than shareholders, and small rather than big. Some people talk about these changes as negative or protectionist, something that will reduce growth or create conflict and decrease our ability to work together as a planet. They feel that there's nothing between the 1990s and the 1930s. But I disagree. I think that more focus on local, more focus on what is happening in the communities that elect people that make policy is crucial to saving what's best about globalization, and namely that the sense that the world is not a zero-sum game and the nations can work together to solve humanity's problems and make the world a better place. But that kind of cooperation requires belief in the system itself and the sense that we're not living in a rigged system that works mainly for a minority of the world's citizens. And too many people that I know, too many people that I grew up with simply don't have faith in that system right now. And changing that is going to mean changing a lot of things, changing the balance between capital and labor, citizens and corporations, markets and the state. So maybe just as I end, I'll invoke the words of an academic who's not here, Harvard professor Danny Roderick, who is one of my favorite people. And he has long argued that democracy, national sovereignty, and global economic integration are mutually incompatible. We can have two of the three, but never have all three simultaneously and in full. And to me, it's clear that at this moment, we need to step back from totally unfettered globalization and remoor to work, prosperity, and place together. I think we're entering a new era, and it's going to come with new challenges and opportunities, but we should embrace them. I'll stop there. Sure. Yeah, I'll take a couple questions if we have some time, 10 minutes or so.
Hi, so I'm happy that you see good things down the road, but as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, thinking about employment and what I see as the fundamental injustice of involuntary unemployment, what I don't really see happening is a commitment to see that we eliminate that, at least in the aggregate, not perfectly ever, and so I grew up in Youngstown, Ohio. And my whole thinking about this is from growing up in Youngstown, Ohio, and I guess you know what happened in Youngstown, Ohio. And I go back to Youngstown, Ohio quite a bit, and it's not happening there. And gee, I would really like to think there's a lot of human capital there going to waste, and I don't see anything happening to take advantage of that human capital. Do you?
I do. Now, it's a slow process. It took us 40 years to get here. I think it's going to take us at least 40 to get to a better place, but I'll give you one example. So we all know that Youngstown, Ohio, and Frankfort, Indiana, where I grew up, and Gary, where Joe Stiglitz grew up, they're not going back to what they were, right? We're not pretending that that's going to happen, and we know that technology is going to shift jobs higher and higher up certainly the manufacturing and also the white-collar food chain. So this isn't about arguing that we want to bring back the manufacturing economy of the past, but it is about arguing that we can deploy human capital in new ways that will be more productive. And I would point, actually, in Ohio to Cleveland. Something like the Cleveland Clinic, for example. Small example, but gets at, all right, where are the jobs of the future going to be? We know that they're going to be in the caring economy, healthcare, education, childcare. With the right policy tweaks, we can start to push labor towards those areas, and I think combine what David Goodhart, he talks about head, hands, heart, some of the heart and hands work, which I think we are desperately in need of. I think we've got way too much head, not nearly enough heart, and maybe we need a bit more hands as well. And use technology and training programs to create higher productive workers at exactly the time when retiring baby boomers and increased healthcare needs are going to be driving up inflation. And piece by piece, these things are starting to happen. I mean, I must be the only person still optimistic in the media about Joe Biden. But, I look out, and for all the things you could say he's failing at, well, look at what's being done with childcare. We are going to get essentially free childcare for under twos for people that make $75,000 or less. And we're going to get major discounts for those that make $150,000 or less. I can tell you, as a working mother that was single and had 2 children when I made $150,000, that would have been a game changer for me. If I could have spent 7% of my income rather than 30% on childcare, big deal. Now, all those things coming together in cities and in communities, I mean, Cleveland has done incredible things by taking human capital, training people across silos, deploying technology. I mean, the level of job creation is off the charts compared to other parts of Ohio. I don't think there's one top-down solution, but I see so many bottom-up solutions that are happening. I'm actually really optimistic. And one of the things we didn't really have time for, but in my book, I'm giving examples in industries like agriculture, textiles, high-tech, healthcare, how this is happening, and trying to sketch together some of the connective thread about what we could learn. Maybe one more question in the back?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I confess I disagree, or I'm not sure I fully agree with all your diagnostics. So things you mentioned, for instance, that the fall of union membership, when we see that the trend since the late 40s, beginning of the 50s, the shift from agriculture, which I think it's cross-cutting across all developed economies towards service and manufacturing. And one thing that struck me was when you said that China is doing great, and then you accused the US of big tech surveillance or big tech capitalism, which I think ironic, knowing the surveillance we see, in fact, in China. I don't think China is doing great, and I honestly think, call me naive, that it's still wrong to arrest someone for thinking differently. And I wanted to ask that to the previous speaker, but...
I would completely agree with you. My only point was that in terms of sheer growth and lifting people out of poverty, China's system has done very, very well. I'm extremely anti-surveillance capitalism, and that's one of the reasons I think that the US and Europe do need to come up with a totally different tech and trade paradigm that's based on liberal values.
Agreed, and I'm so sorry that we didn't have time to ask questions. I think in the good Chinese way, no questions allowed.
There's lunch and coffee.
He's on Zoom.
Okay.
But my question to you was, and I mean, I worked in public policy before, and I understand your point that people are not numbers, but I mean, I don't know any other way of designing economic policy without models, imperfect as they are. And so what incentives do you need to put in place to bring these, say, more human-oriented economy that you were discussing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I'll share a couple of conversations about some work that's already happening. And I don't know if this work is happening at Columbia, but I do know that it's happening at some other institutions. BARD actually just got a $300,000 grant. Dimitri Papdimitriou, who's the former Greek minister who's over there heading the Levy Institute now, is doing work specifically to look in a really real-world way at what is happening in households. Who is doing what? What are women doing? How long is it taking them to do that? What does that mean for consumption and production? And yeah, ultimately, these are things that are going to be quantified and go into models, but what we're talking about is looking at real people and how they're living their lives, not making assumptions based on data that, first of all, is increasingly historically inaccurate I'm going to just say the ivory tower, in ways that have very little sort of experimental rigor often. We need to actually get out in the ground. I mean, I think that economists need to start working much more like field scientists and biologists, go out and see how people are really living. And by the way, just as an aside, everybody that is at a conference like this needs to spend more time in red states. That's what I would say. I think that would do a lot to change the tenor of politics in this country. Is that it? All right, cool. Thank you.